And so they have a party, they all get drunk, and then there's a moment where everything changes and where there's a fake sort of confrontation. The women leave, the women know what this means, and she is killed, smothered in the usual way. He's not going to interrupt the party. He's got enough money for more drink. We'll just shove the body under the bed, and nothing should interrupt a good party. Some whiskey is sprinkled across the bed just to make sure that any offensive smells are blinded. The ladies are brought back in, and the party and the dance continues. So it'll just be like a lot of the parties you've been at, Simon. Oh, you
Yep, sounds very familiar, Tom. Very. Hi, Tom. How are you?
Good evening, Simon. I'm very well. How are you getting on?
I'm fantastic. And I'm just looking at the figures for Crime Time Inc. and we're rising. It was steady before, but the acceleration factor's there now. Tom, we'll press on tonight because we've got brand new subject matter tonight. And as always, we're absolutely privileged to have somebody that was actually involved in the case, because I think you were a young beat man when this case came to light in Edinburgh, around about 1828.
It was actually the year before I joined, but thanks for that compliment. Yep.
And Tom, I'm not going to steal your thunder by naming it, but this is really a landmark case. The Edinburgh Force was in its infancy. Public order was a big matter about this case as well. And probably it's one of the most famous cases in Scottish criminal history that is so misconceived and misunderstood by the general public because of the press and all the things that have grown up round about it over the years. You worked it as a cold case, Tom. Quite often we get questions in about people about cold cases, because you've referred to that numerous times throughout the previous episodes, that you're a cold case expert. You did it while you were a serving police officer, and you've done it since. And now with your writing and the books that you've written, you treat these as cold cases, and that's what you've done with this one. Can you tell us what we're going to talk about, and tell us a wee bit about that cold case methodology, if you like? How you get to, when there's so much nonsense spoken about these things over 200 years, how you get to the truth.
Yeah, that's right, Simon. The crimes of Burke and Hare, or the Westport murders, as they should more properly be referred to, probably some of the most famous crimes and the most misrepresented crimes in the history of criminal investigation. And it's fascinating because, of course, they took place in Edinburgh, which is my city, and everybody has known all about the crimes of Burke and Hare. And there have been many books written about these crimes from different angles, each trying to take a piece of these crimes and the infamy of these crimes to use for their own purposes. Now, for instance, very famous book written about the crimes in Burke and Hare, which is from the point of view of Irish immigration. And of course, that was a factor in the crime. So there's a book angled at that. There's been books written about it from a feminist point of view, looking at the position of the wives of Burke and Hare and what role, if any, they played. So there's been all of this stuff. It's been on television, it's been film. There was a black comedy made about it, sort of a slapstick comedy made about the crimes. And so all of that. And I often tell people that when you're looking at a cold case, it's like looking at a piece of furniture that has been painted and varnished and painted and varnished and painted and varnished many, many times over the period of years, to the extent that it's kind of lost its shape and lost its definition. And so the first thing you've got to do when you're looking at an old case is strip away all of that. Strip away all of that excess stuff that's gathered over the years and get back to the base materials and what actually happened, and try, and if you can, find contemporaneous records which you can rely on. So you've got to go back to basics.
And where would you get the likes of those contemporaries records, Tom, for the likes of Burke and Hare? I know you've done this before with Ruxton, with other cases, and I know that Burke and Hare is going to form part of your new book that's coming out later this year. Where would people, I suppose people nowadays, with access to the internet, they're looking at their DNA, they're looking at their genealogy, they're looking at all sorts of things from the past that we didn't have access to before. Does the internet play a big part in that as well?
The internet plays a huge part, but you've got to be very careful, because a lot of what is on the internet is also nonsense. So what you really have to do, and what I did, and we're very fortunate here because in Scotland, going way back to the 17th century, we've been very good at keeping records. We really are good at that. And so what I did was I went back to the High Court records and got a paper version of the trial of William Burke, which took place on Christmas Eve in the year 1828. And like High Court trials now, everything is meticulously noted down, often in copperplate handwriting, which has later been subscribed into type. So there's a complete record of the trial and all the evidence that was led and why it was led and the cross-examination. So you've got a goldmine of information there, which you can trust as being accurate. The other place to go to, of course, because the Burke and Hare and the trial of William Burke was so notable in terms of medical science, then Edinburgh University also have contemporaneous records kept about how things worked and the aftermath, because this is one of these crimes, Simon, where all the concentration is on the horror of the crimes themselves, and they were absolutely horrible. But the really interesting point of view, from my point of view, is looking at what the learning was and what changes were brought about as a result of these crimes. Despite the passage of 200 years, there's actually a lot more accurate records than you would imagine about these crimes.
So let's set the scene then, because probably the biggest misconception about Burke and Hare, and the term that you hear, as soon as you say Burke and Hare worldwide, people say grave robbers. That's what they think of them as, and it's what they've been misportrayed as over so many platforms. Explain that for us, because grave robbing was a big problem at the time. Tell me how Burke and Hare don't fit into that grave robbing model and what the grave robbing involved at that time.
They're always referred to as body snatchers. And that is to say that they disinterred dead bodies. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But I think if you want to fully understand Burke and Hare and what happened, you've got to go a little bit back and just see the social context in which these murders took place. And you've got to go back to around about 1800, the early 1800s, and the coming of the Industrial Revolution in Scotland. So society was changing radically from a very agricultural, rural society, and people were moving into the towns and moving into the cities where there was money to be made at the start of the Industrial Revolution. So cities like Edinburgh and Glasgow were growing. There were particular social issues happening in Edinburgh from about 1800. Because before 1800, Edinburgh had been a small city based round about the old town that we now know. So that's the High Street, the Lawn Market, the Grass Market, the Castle, Holyrood Palace, just round about there. And everybody who was in the city lived there. So people who were practicing law at the High Court, the university professors, they lived in the top flats of the tenement buildings in the High Street. And in the middle flats, the middle classes, that's where they get the name, were the tradesmen. And on the ground floor, there were the poor people, the peasants. And as you came down the stories to the ground level floor, so the living became a lot more, shall we say, difficult, because, of course, there was no sewerage of any sort. So there would be open sewers on the streets. But for all the problems of the old town, at least it was a relatively homogeneous place. So there was money. There was a sort of an economic cycle, because the rich people on the top floor paid the middle classes to do their work, and the middle classes in turn cascaded money down to the working classes. So it was a kind of an economic model that worked. But in 1800, somebody had the brilliant idea, and it was a brilliant idea, to build the new town of Edinburgh. So they drained the old Norloch, which is now Princess Street Gardens. They put bridges across there. And in what we now know as Princess Street, George Street, Queen Street, all that beautifully laid out city, which is on the other side of the Princess Street Gardens, that was known as the New Town.
Tom, we spoke about the Old Town with the recent podcast with the World's End Murders, because the World's End pub is at one end of that old town where the wall was. Could you explain the boundaries to the city and what the old city would entail? Because it was a security thing, wasn't it, with the castle being one part of that boundary?
That's right. It was a very small city, which anybody who visits Edinburgh now, it was centred on the castle, Edinburgh Castle, to give security to the people there. But basically, the old town of Edinburgh was the spine of rock running down from the castle down to about the area of the World's End, so it's halfway down the Royal Mile. The Palace of Holyrood House was more or less abandoned at that time because the sewage ran down the hill into it. And after the Battle of Flodden, there was a wall built round the town to keep it secure. It didn't work, but that was the intention. So by the 1820s, we had a very rich new town and a very poor, in fact, abjectly poor, old town of Edinburgh. And it had more or less descended into a den of thieves. Grassmarket and Cowgate was just she-beans, illegal drinking houses, brothels of the worst description. And one traveller who came through the city at that time, going through the old town, described it as comprising the filthiest dens of the city and a population indescribably brutal and debased. A lot of that was to do with alcohol, the unregulated sale of it was called whiskey, but it wasn't whiskey as we would know it. It was just illegal firewater, basically.
Hooch.
Yeah, absolutely. Nobody knew really what they were drinking, but the effects were dramatic, and the huge number of deaths and deprivation caused by alcohol at that time.
Tom, the Edinburgh Police was newly formed at that time. I think it was 1805. What would policing look like at that time then in Edinburgh?
Edinburgh Police were formed in 1805, 5 years after Glasgow, and very much following the Glasgow model. For quite a number of years, 30 or 40 years, people were very suspicious about the new police model because they didn't think it would be able to hold the line if there were trouble. And of course, Edinburgh had a history of riot and disorder. In 1791, about 30, 40 years before we were talking about, Captain William Porteous, the captain of the town guard, was lynched, and there followed a riot called the Porteous Riots. And the town guard were the sort of the people who came before the police, and they were just basically a bunch of drunken old soldiers who patrolled the streets in their red tunics and carrying these big, long Lochaber axes, and they were hopeless, really. And so it was decided, as the city was developing, as the new town was being built, they had to have a new police force, a modern police force. So in 1805, Edinburgh City Police was formed. Now, it was 200 men, headed by a superintendent, but 70% of these men were basically night shift patrolmen or watchmen. So there were a very small number of police officers on the street, and very few of them, only a handful of them, were designated as being criminal police. In other words, the forerunners of the detectives that we knew. But there was a lot of distrust. Nobody really believed that come the day, the new Edinburgh City Police would be able to hold the line. And everybody thought that when that time came and there was trouble, they would have to call in the army, as they had in the previous times. After the Porteous riots, they had to call in the army. There were barracks at Pearse Hill. There was soldiers based at Edinburgh Castle. And the city fathers always had an eye to if they needed to call in the dragoons. The big problem there was a political one, because it was very easy to call in the army, but it was very difficult to get rid of them. So there was a real concern. And because of this, the new Edinburgh City Force was formed as the first professional police force. But the jury was out as regards their competence and their ability to hold the line. And of course, they were expensive. And all throughout this, we see this in terms of policing. And we see it today. Politicians trying to save a few quid, trying to do things on the cheap. And never was that more relevant than the forming of the new Edinburgh City Police. So we've got the old town, which is literally falling about, which is a den of iniquity. We've got the new town, which is growing in popularity and wealth. And anybody who was anybody wanted a house in the new town, the lords and ladies of Scotland, the judges, the professors, everybody wanted to go and stay.
Senior police officers, no doubt. Deputy chief constables, probably.
Well, I would have certainly hoped so. I don't know where the superintendent of police stayed at that time, but I would like to think he aspired to something like that, yeah. So anyway, so this was all going on. And at the same time, the Industrial Revolution was coming in. And so people were flocking to Edinburgh and to Glasgow to find work. And there was abject poverty in most parts of Ireland and northern Scotland. And so numbers of people came in looking for work, and particularly from Ireland. Everybody looks to Ireland and says the potato famine of the 1840s was the great sort of dividing line. In actual fact, they'd been leaving for quite some time before that. And quite a number of them came to Edinburgh and Glasgow to try and get work connected with the new Industrial Revolution. And of course, one of the things that was happening then in the 1820s was the digging of canals. Canals were seen as the highways of the 18th century to allow goods to be brought back and forward from Edinburgh to Glasgow, particularly manufactured goods brought across. No roads at that time that we would call it, no tarmac-adam roads, just rough roads. So the canals were super efficient. And so they all came across for the digging of canals.
Because everything was horse and cart in those days, of course, in the early 1800s. We had no motorised vehicles at that time.
None whatsoever. It was horse and cart. And the thing is, a horse could pull a barge along the canal that could haul 10 times the cargo that you could haul in a cart. So the canals were superbly efficient, but of course didn't last long because in the 1840s the railways came in. But in the 1820s, the Union Canal was being built, which left Edinburgh and then joined the Forth and Clyde Canal to go through to Glasgow. No mechanisation then at all, so it was all dug by hand, and the people who dug the canals were called navigators. And that's where the word navvy comes from. And thousands of people came, particularly from Ireland, to help dig the canals, and they settled in Scotland. And that's one of the reasons why there is such a large Irish diaspora, both from Edinburgh right through to Glasgow. They actually settled down where they came to work.
Did Burke and Hare come over here together to find work?
No.
You know.
Let's talk about Burke and Hare now and the principles connected here, because it's not just Burke and Hare we're talking about here. It's also their wives, and their wives played a hugely important part in what we're going to talk about. So William Burke came from the county of Tyrone in his mid-30s, described as a short, powerfully built man. He'd been a soldier and apparently had fought at the Battle of Waterloo, although very difficult to get any historical record of that. He was a cobbler of sorts and certainly had shoe mending materials in his house, but he was one of these people who was so given to drink, and drink dominated his whole life, that whatever he did, he only did it for as long as to get enough drink. And he arrived in Edinburgh in 1827, along with his partner called Helen McDougall. Now, Helen was a Scottish girl born in Falkirk, and she had met Burke while he had been working on the canals in Falkirk. And she had left her family, her 2 children, her husband, and come east with William Burke to set up a new life. Now, I had no idea what kind of family life she had in Falkirk, but if it was an improvement going with William Burke, it must have been pretty poor. He was constantly drunk, he would assault her, and she herself was no shining light. She is described as of a dull, morose disposition, whether drunk or sober. She didn't have much going for her. One of the remarkable things about this whole thing, Simon, is that when you're reading the descriptions of these people, back in these days, they didn't beat about the bush. They actually said what they thought. William Burke's described as peaceable when sober, violent when drunk or provoked. That's how he's described. So you get this picture of this short, squat man, much given to drink. And they eventually come through to Edinburgh in 1827, and they meet up with William Hare, who is an Irishman as well. He's from Newry, and he's been in Edinburgh for about 10 years. He's been there since 1818. And he's married, moved into lodgings in the Westport, and the man who ran the lodgings, Mr. Logue, he died mysteriously. There's no indication of how he died. And then Hare took up with his wife, Margaret, and married her. So you get William and Margaret Hare, who are running this lodging house, which used to belong to Margaret Hare's previous husband. And when I say lodging house, it's a flea pit. There's about 4 or 5 letting rooms in it, but it's a dive.
Was this in Tanner's Post?
Yes, that's right. That's right. Now, Hare was a horrible person. He's described as being of a ferocious and tyrannical disposition, much inclined to quarrel, very obstreperous when in liquor. He was ugly appearance and ugly temperament. That's how he's described. You really are starting to paint this picture. And Margaret Hare, his wife, was more than a match for him. She's described, and again, I love these people because they don't beat about the bush. There's no niceties. She was described as being a desperate character, completely given to drink, often brutally intoxicated, and seldom without a pair of black eyes. And then it goes on to say, she and Hare fought continuously, Margaret always having the last word and the last blow.
Oh dear. So he was a victim of domestic abuse.
Yeah, I think she was a victim of domestic abuse, and I think she handed it out herself. I think there was nothing to draw between the four of them, to be honest with you.
I think we've met a few women like her over the years, Tom, haven't we?
We have indeed. We have indeed. But all this revisionist stuff about, oh, they must have been victims and this and that, the facts do not support that. So anyway, they got together and they were related through drink. They became friendly through drink. All they did was eke out enough money, get enough money from stealing, from little bits of odd jobs to buy drink. And alcohol, and sometimes too opiates, laudanum, was at the very centre of their life and defined the whole of their life, and led to their offending and led to the catastrophe that occurred.
Many times on Crime Time Inc. already, and we will in the future, we've spoken about addiction and about the problems of abuse of substance. And throughout our careers, throughout every policeman's career, we see people like that. People have priorities in their life. You could make a hierarchy of the priorities in your life. And for most of us, that would be your family. For some people, it would be their religion, their faith. For other people that you and I again have known, it would be their work. They're 100%, their work comes first in their career. Or for other people, it's power or money or fame or wealth. But the people that we come in touch with most commonly are the people who drink or drugs or some kind of a substance abuse is right at the top. They'll do anything, and they'll rob from their own family, and they'll do anything to feed that habit that they've grown over the years. And that's where we're talking about here with Burke and Hare, isn't it?
It absolutely is. And you're absolutely right. They were functioning, but chronic alcoholics and addicts. There's no question about it. And there was only one thing that mattered. When they got up in the morning, they would eke out a little food, but what they were really looking for was money to buy more whiskey, as they described it. But again, let's not get confused. This is not the whiskey that you and I would drink now. It's a different thing altogether. It's firewater. So it's important, this, because in trying to assess the parameters of these crimes, what we can certainly say is that Burke and Hare only knew each other and operated with each other for 1 year, between the end of 1827 and the end of 1828. That's the perimeters of our offending. That's where they actually met and started to operate together. The first thing we know about Burke and Hare is that they worked together in odd jobs, and they would turn their hand to anything, and they would steal if they possibly could, just whatever it took to get enough to drink. But what we know is that early in 1828, an old man who had been lodging in Hare's lodging house died of natural causes, and he was owed rent. And so the two of them got together and they wondered how they would get their money back, and they decided to try and sell his body to the surgeons. And that's the surgeons who operated in Edinburgh University.
So that's the marketplace, Tom, that was there. Tell us a wee bit about that economic market, because it was the laws of supply and demand again, wasn't it, at work here? Edinburgh was a seat of learning. It was a way ahead. Globally, I would suggest, in regards to pathology, in regards to science, medical science. So that really opened the market up.
That's right. There were several power blocks within Edinburgh. There was the church, obviously, and there was the law. The high courts were there. The Parliament had moved south, of course, in the 1700s, but there was the church and there was the law. There was the army based at the castle, and then there was the university. And the university had the most enormous prestige, particularly the medical school. And within the medical school, there were 5 or 6 world-renowned professors of anatomy working at that time and drawing enormous crowds of paying students. And university was very different in these days, and you didn't get young people going along after school and joining the university to study when they were 18 or 19. They were mature people who had saved up considerable or were of considerable wealth. You had to pay your way. And if you were going to go to sit and listen to some of the famous, world famous lecturers on anatomy and other aspects of medicine, then you had to pay, and it wasn't cheap. So it was an incredibly vibrant economic model. And one of the leading lecturers in anatomy was a man called Dr. Robert Knox. And Knox is an Edinburgh man. He was a prodigy, went to the Edinburgh's high school, had been an army surgeon at the Battle of Waterloo, was reputed to have cut off more legs and arms than anybody else living, and was a charismatic lecturer and speaker. And he was really at the height of his powers. In the 1820s, he was about 35 to 40 years old. And as I say, huge attraction to people wanting to come and learn about the secrets of the human body. People were fascinated by anatomy. Robert Knox had 400 paying students who used to come along and listen to his lectures. He had a lecture theatre in Surgeon Square, just opposite the old university. And he carried out lectures there morning and night. And so different people would come along, hugely powerful, very, very wealthy. But as you've just described, what he needed was a constant supply of fresh bodies. And we'll come on just a minute and talk about grave robbing, because this is relevant. He needed fresh bodies, and he needed a fresh cadaver every week in order to carry out his lectures. There was fantastic anatomical drawings made at that time. But if you were paying top dollar to come along and hear Robert Knox, you wanted the real thing. They wanted the real dissections on the dissecting table. That was all part of the amazing attraction to come along to Robert Knox. Now, Knox was not alone. There was 5 or 6 other lecturers who were as good, perhaps, as he was. So this is just not one man operating. This is a small industry operating. And you can imagine that the demand for bodies was incredibly high and far outstripped the supply. Because the only legal way of getting bodies at that time was people who had been executed or people who were what they described as foundlings. In other words, people who had died without any kind of issue, any kind of relatives. And so there was an industry in obtaining bodies for the surgeons. And all of the surgeons appointed kind of finders, almost like agents, who would go out and try and get fresh bodies for their employers. It's all recorded. Some of the ploys they used were incredible. There was this one chap called Lees, Mr. Lees, who habitually dressed in mourning black. So he had a long black coat on, a black hat. And he employed a bunch of urchins, street boys, who would go around all the lodging houses, and any number of lodging houses in Edinburgh, people coming to find work, to find out whether anybody there was in poor health. And if anybody there was in poor health and looked to be on the way out, then Lees would come along and introduce himself as being the long-lost uncle or cousin or brother or family member of this person who's about to slip off this mortal coil, and would say that he was totally responsible for him and he would arrange the funeral and all the rest of it. And so he would go to the lodging house keeper and say, look, if my old Uncle Jim, if he slips away, just let me know. I'll take care of everything. And of course, for the lodging house keepers, they didn't want a dead body lying about. They were more than happy. So the minute the person had died, then in would come Lees with his gang of urchins and a wheelbarrow, and they would take the body away, allegedly for Christian burial, but of course it went straight to the surgeons. And it was good money. They were getting £7 to £10, and sometimes 10 guineas, if it was a particularly good subject. And that was a lot of money. That was a month's wages for a skilled man. It was good trade. So it's a bit like the drugs trade. And it's like the sex industry. It's about supply and demand. And if there is a demand, so there will be a supply given the proper price mechanism. And that's exactly what happened.
The other thing to cover there, Tom, the lack of refrigeration. Obviously, that was the problem, that they wanted fresh bodies. They'd be no use to them if they'd been dead a week or so. And the second part of it is that grave robbing really wouldn't be the ideal way to do that.
Yeah, there's all sorts of the schemes hatched. One scheme that was tried was that there was a lot of dead bodies, obviously, in London, but there wasn't the demand for them in London. So some bright spark thought they would get a fast sailing ship and bring them up the East Coast. That was the fastest way to get from London to Scotland, was in a boat. So they'd fill it with bodies and bring it up. But of course, if they were storm-bound or storm-delayed in any way, then there was a whole lot of burials at sea and the economic model didn't work. So that wasn't any good.
Okay.
Grave robbing. Now, grave robbing had been, it was never as common as it was made out to be. The reason why grave robbing has become so well-known and notorious is the horror of the idea of being disinterred. It's just this Halloween image of a body being dug up. And it was done, and funnily enough, one of the last cases for it was through in Glasgow. And it was a lecturer at Glasgow University who was caught disinterring a body. But the problem was that they were very seldom fresh because people died. It was 2 or 3 days before they were buried. And then quite often people were so frightened of the whole idea of the relatives being dug up that they would sit and guard the grave. They would build a mort safe, which was a big metal grill that would cover the grave. You can still see some of these in the cemeteries in Edinburgh. So, and also the surgeons did not want any suspicion. They could tell perfectly a body that had been prepared for burial. And they used to say to their agents, look, don't bring me any bodies that have been dug up because it'll get us into trouble.
And I think the grave robbing was more exactly what it says. I think it was to do with people being buried with valuables and with things like that back in those days. And the grave robbers were actually robbing the grave, not of the body, but of any valuables or other precious items, jewellery or whatever.
Grave goods, the people tended to be buried with some of their valuables. And that was the first target. And of course, also people got wise to it. People used to keep the bodies of their dead ones until putrefaction had set in. They would guard them. And there were watchtowers built around cemeteries, and they used to employ watchmen to watch out on freshly dug graves. So there's all sorts of reasons why grave robbing was a problem. And of course, it was very difficult to do. And like most criminals, Burke and Hare decided to do it the easy way. And completely by accident, they hit on this scheme whereby they sold this body of this man who had died in the lodging house and hadn't paid his rent. They sold him to a fellow called William Patterson, who was Dr. Robert Knox's agent. And it's like in the drugs field, you and I both know, Simon, that's the relationship with the dealer, the user and the dealer. It was a similar relationship because Patterson says to him, thanks very much, gentlemen. I hope we see a lot more of you. I hope we see you again. I'm open for business. Patterson's an interesting character in this. He's a kind of middleman, and if we were investigating it today, then Patterson would be the kind of linchpin between the foot soldiers and the top men.
Can I just try and summarise a wee bit there, Tom, because that's a lot of history. It's a lot of social history you've given us about the Edinburgh in that day, Industrial Revolution, Irish people coming over here for work to dig the canals and so on and so forth. Is it fair to summarise by saying that Burke and Hare were probably only one pair of lots of people, lots of guys who were out there trying to supply bodies to the doctors to keep that supply line going for the pathologists and the scientists up at the university? So they were only two of many, would you say?
I think so. I think it's reasonable to calculate that. Put it this way. There were 5 or 6 lecturers in anatomy working round about Edinburgh University at that time. Even assuming that they weren't as busy as Robert Knox, and most of them were, they would need between 4 and 5 bodies a week. So you're talking about 4 or 5 bodies a week were needed to satisfy the demands of the anatomists. 4 or 5 bodies a week times 52, you then get a picture of exactly the size of this trade. So actually, when you look at Burke and Hare, you're actually only seeing the tip of the iceberg. It's like in our times when you bust a drugs network, and you take down a drugs network and you take out a dealer and you take all things. You know full well that actually all you've done is picked off one thread from a huge tapestry. Now, the interesting thing is that nobody really knew how many people were in Edinburgh to start with, and nobody knew how many lived and how many died in a year.
Yeah.
There's one estimate which always draws me, and that was that there was a very accurate survey done in the 1840s of street prostitutes in Edinburgh. It was estimated that there were 900 street prostitutes in Edinburgh at that time in the 1840s, and that a third of them died every year. But that kind of data is very, very difficult to find because, of course, the whole births, deaths, and marriages, the keeping of records, only came in at a later date.
That whole society, that whole community you're talking about in Old Edinburgh, the lawlessness and the homelessness, there'd be children born not registered. The whole thing of record keeping is almost non-existent in an environment like that, where people are scraping a living day to day. Death would be day and daily, it would be common. I wonder what the birth rate was and what the mortality rate was for infants in there, for example. We forget, without antibiotics, without modern medicine, what probably the average age or the life expectancy would be in the 30s or 40s, Tom.
It'll be about 45. If you're doing well, you're 45. If you were a manual labourer, 45 before something it got you. Because you see, I mean, it was a very, very unhealthy atmosphere as well. Disease was common. The water was putrid. And diseases like smallpox, diphtheria, tuberculosis. A tremendous number of people died of TB. And so, life was brutal and short if you were living in the old town.
Okay. That set the scene very nicely for Burke and Hare. So they've made their first £10 or 10 guineas or whatever they got for their first victim. And this is where they start to get a bit more creative. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think what they recognised was that there was an opportunity here. It was easy money. And so at the start, because Hare had a lodging house, what they looked for was people who were vulnerable. We'd call it vulnerable now. There was a lot of vulnerable people there, either vulnerable because they were old, they were infirm, they were given to drink, or they were physically unwell. And it's very clear that the first 2 or 3 of their victims were people who were ill and unable to resist or were reduced by drinks. We'd buy them drink, ply them a drink. And it was very important that the bodies were fresh, but also unmarked. This is where we come into the method of operation. And they hit on a system which is now called burking, after William Burke. But basically what it is it's overlying someone and smothering them. So you overlie their chest, you put your weight on their chest, and then you seal off their mouth and nose so as to smother them. Of course, the good thing about that is there's no signs. There's no signs of death. There's no marks. There's no signs of violence, which might embarrass the doctors. And it's very clear from what William Burke said eventually in his sort of dying deposition, in terms of what William Hare said, in terms of what other people have gathered, that they start on this pattern. And we know and can count about 13 or 14 different victims. Most of them people who had no Edinburgh connections and who were strangers from out of town and that nobody would miss. And that they were dispatched in this way. The wives played an active role. They applied people with drink. They reassured them, tempted them back to the lodging houses. So they were art and part to all of this criminal activity. Now, they started to get sloppy. I mean, as you know, we've had this before. If you are a heavy drinker and you're drinking a lot, then you start to make mistakes. And the first mistakes that Burke and Hare made was to actually victimise 2 people who were local to Edinburgh and who were well known in the old town. And this was a fundamental mistake. And I think if they just stuck to their original plan of killing people who were strangers to the city, then I think the chances of them being caught or being detected on down the road would have been reduced. First of all, they picked on and they murdered a young woman called Mary Patterson. Mary Patterson was very well known in the old town. She was a beautiful young woman, and she was a very voluptuous young woman, and she was a part-time sex worker. And so they killed Mary Patterson. They sold her body to the surgeons, to Dr. Knox, through William Patterson. There's no relation between the, just the same name, through his agent to Dr. Knox. But when she appears on the dissecting table, a lot of the students knew her.
Okay.
And when I say knew her, I mean, in the biblical sense, they knew her. There was much alarm. They said, there's Mary, but we only saw her 2 days ago and she was in perfect health. And of course, this raised suspicion. And William Burke was questioned about it by Knox and said, what happened here? And he gave some explanation about Mary being poisoned herself with drink, which was quite common in these days. The matter was passed off, but there were a lot of people were not happy at seeing Mary Patterson there lying dead. The next mistake they made, they tackled a young fella called Jamie Wilson. He was obviously had some
Daft
learning.
Jamie.
Aye, Daft Jamie. He had some learning disability, but he was a well set up 18-year-old strapping young man who habitually went through the town barefoot. Even though it was snow, he went through the town barefoot, and he was one of these very jolly people who everybody knew and liked, and he had a very good singing voice, and he would sing in the streets and all the rest of it. So he was a local character, and everybody knew Daft Jamie, and they liked him. And his family were local, and they were popular as well. So when Daft Jamie appears on the slab to be dissected, and they tried to disguise his body so that nobody knew it would be Daft Jamie, but everybody recognised him, then there was a real hullabaloo. And once again, Burke was put under suspicion. But once again, he managed to explain it away. He said, well, he died of drink and we found his body. I'm not sure. And life was so cheap at that time that people kind of shrugged and believed it, because people did die every day and daily, dozens of them. And it was just another hard luck story. But it's interesting from a reinvestigation point of view. It's very interesting to see these points of departure, because you can see then where the pattern of offending starts to change and where they start to make mistakes. The biggest mistake they made was on Halloween night of 1828. So they've been involved in this business for 10 months exactly, since the beginning of 1828 through to Halloween, where they victimise what is described as an old Irish woman. Now, my old, she might have been 50, a woman called Marjorie Campbell, who Burke has spotted. And what they do is they go out and about and they spot likely people who they think are vulnerable or weak or suggestible or will take a drink or whatever. And they see Marjorie Campbell. Burke sees Marjorie Campbell begging. And because she's speaking in an Irish accent, he befriends her and says, she's from Ireland too. Come back to the house. We'll give you shelter. You're one of our countrymen. Come back and here's a drink. And the women, Burke and Hare's wives, get involved in reassuring Marjorie Campbell and feeding her, plying her with drink. So the scene is set, and Burke even takes the opportunity to go up to Dr. Knox's agent and say, listen, I have someone for you tonight. So this is a premeditated crime. And lo and behold, there's a lodger who's staying with Burke at the time. He and his wife are shooed out of the place very suspiciously. And later on, this comes back to haunt them. And so they have a party. They all get drunk. And then there's a moment where everything changes and where there's a fake sort of confrontation between Burke and Hare. This is what they've done before. The women leave. The women know what this means. The women leave, whereupon Burke jumps on top of Marjorie Campbell, who is a wee slight woman and has no resistance whatsoever, and she is killed, smothered in the usual way. Now, this is where it all goes wrong and where it has such a familiar ring to it from our work that we've done. It's because they decide that Burke decides that he's not going to interrupt the party. He's got enough money for more drink, and we'll just shove the body under the bed, and nothing should interrupt a good party as long as you've got booze. And so the body of Marjorie Campbell shoved under the bed in the room of Burke's dwelling. There's only really a big double bed and a couple of sticks of furniture. It's a complete disaster of a place. The body is shoved under the bed. Some whiskey is sprinkled across the bed just to make sure that any offensive smells are blinded. The ladies are brought back in, and the party and the dance continues. So it'll just be like a lot of the parties you've been at, Simon. Oh, you
Yep, sounds very familiar, Tom. Very.
very familiar.
Oh, it wasn't dead bodies we put under the bed, just drunken bodies that we would put under the bed.
Funnily enough, of course, that becomes an issue later on because the whole cause of death thing is very difficult. And of course, one of the things that William Burke says is she was drunk and we just put her under the bed to sleep it off, and the poor woman must have expired. Oh dear, how sad. So anyway, so there we have the scene. This party goes on, and eventually the Hares leave to go back to their own lodgings, and Burke and his wife sleep on the bed in a drunken stupor with the body of Marjorie Campbell underneath the bed. So the next morning, Burke's up, and once he gets a bit of a snifter to steady himself, he sets out to try and get rid of the body and take the body up to Dr. Knox. And he's not a man to do these things himself, so he hires a local porter with a tea chest, and they stuff the body into this, double up the body of Marjorie and stick it into the tea chest. And then they all set off about 11 o'clock in the morning in procession, the porter carrying the tea chest, and Burke, Hare, and the two women, they all set off and process up the Grassmarket, up to Surgeon Square, to hand over the body and get the money. And this they do. The body's delivered, it's put in the basement of Robert Knox's surgery, and they get the money. And of course, the first thing they do with the money is they head to the pub. And so far, all is well, all is good. The problem comes when the lodger came back to the house, when Burke was out getting a snifter and getting some food for breakfast, before the body had been removed, and sees the body of Marjorie Campbell under the table and gets out sharpish. And he and his wife have a long conversation about what they're going to do. On the one hand, they're frightened of William Burke. He's a violent man. But on the other hand, they're decent people and they think she'd report it to the police. So they mull this over for a good part of the day. And eventually, in the late afternoon, they gather their courage and they go up to the police headquarters, the new police headquarters at Edinburgh, just off the High Street, just opposite where St Giles Cathedral is now. And there we get a wee break of luck. You and I both know that in these things you need a wee stroke of luck. And they go in and they report this to the constable, and of course they could have been brushed off if they'd got the wrong person. But it just so happens that on duty that night is a Sergeant Major Fisher. Now, it's a rank we're not familiar with in the police, but it's just below lieutenant. And Sergeant Major Fisher is one of the very few criminal police in Edinburgh. And he hears the story and acts immediately. He knows that he's going into a den of thieves. He knows he's going into a sort of no-go area where the police didn't usually patrol. So he takes the biggest cop he can find with him, and they head right down to where Burke's lodgings are. And this is about 7 o'clock at night by this time. They get into Burke's lodgings and they find Burke and his wife lying there in a state of drunkenness. Apart from the body being missing, the crime scene is intact. The clothes of Marjorie Campbell have been stripped from her because clothes are an identifying feature, as we know, and Burke and Hare knew this, so the bodies were all delivered to the surgeon naked, so there'd be no identifying clothes. So the clothes are still there. Fisher takes possession of the clothes. He sees this blood on some of the straw, which is scattering on the floor. He takes possession of that. He starts doing a little house to house, and he finds out that somebody noted that morning that a porter had arrived to carry a heavy box away from the house. He does a further local investigation. He traces the porter, and he finds out that night that the porter took the body, or took the box, which he thinks contained a body of a woman, up to Dr. Knox's house. Now, this is the important thing. Dr. Knox is a leading member of the community, very well known in Edinburgh, and there could have been a little bit of reluctance to actually tackle a man of that status, but Fisher fears no evil, and he gets one of his inspectors, one of the senior officers. He says, listen, I'm going up to Knox's house. I'm going to get out of that house and I'm going to search it, and I'm going to do it now. And a little before midnight, Fisher, together with the inspector and a couple of these constables, arrive at Dr. Knox's house. Remember how prestigious this man is, remember his social status, but they don't bother about that. They get into the house, they search the house, and they recover the body of Marjorie Campbell, still stuffed into the tea chest, still lying in the basement where it's been left.
So they all got a bit blasé, didn't they?
Yes.
And old Fisher, he sorted them out. Our first detective.
Listen, I'll tell you what, you got to say, you look at this guy, you know what? He did everything pretty well. He really did. He got onto it quickly. He secured the locus. He followed up the leads. He preserved the evidence. He recovered the body. And of course, what he does then is as soon as he got the body, he goes right back and he arrests Burke and his wife. And he arrests Hare and his wife as well. And he keeps them all separate. He keeps them all separate.
Wow. The thing that he did, Tom, which was so impressive going back 200 years, he ignored the politics side of it. He just did the job. He just got on with the job and got it done. Fantastic.
He did. And it's very hard now for us to imagine the class divide. We still talk about a class divide in this country, and there is still a class divide in this country. But then was much, much greater. And an eminent professor at the university, for some common policeman to have the temerity to force his way into his house, obviously very courageous, professional ethics, and he took it on. He wasn't going to be sidetracked by anything like that. He wasn't going to wait and apply for a warrant and go to a sheriff, because he knew fine that the body could have disappeared by then. And if he didn't have the body, he had absolutely nothing. He just had hearsay from people who would not be classified as being reliable witnesses. And so he acted quickly and he recovered the body. And thereafter started an incredibly challenging period for the Scottish justice system and for the new Edinburgh police, not just in the investigation of the crime, but in the aftermath of the crime and all of what happened as a result.
Well, that's a fantastic introduction to the story, the amazing story of Burke and Hare, and how it's become folklore as well, because it's and why it's been made into a movie and books written about it. All of that's going to become very apparent in the second part, which is just as compelling when we look at the law around about it and the proceedings thereafter and how it evolved thereafter. I can't wait to get into it again. But, George, the time's flown by tonight talking about this because it is a fantastic, intriguing subject. Tom, thanks again for bringing that to us, and we'll speak soon.
Speak soon, Simon. Looking forward to it. Take care.
Thanks, Tom.
Next time on Crime Time Inc.
He says, I'm going to make an example of you. He says, not only are you going to be publicly hanged, he said, but your body is going to thereafter be given to the surgeons for dissection, public dissection and public display. So not only was his body going to be given to the surgeons, of course, which is ironic to an extreme, but all this was going to be public. He was going to be dissected publicly, and thereafter his skeleton would be displayed publicly. A great majority of the people who attend the public dissection of William Burke are women. A lot of them are middle class, well-to-do. Some of the medical students are taking an opportunity to nip forward and take a bit of skin from William Burke and take a finger and all the rest of it. So as time goes on, William Burke is a rapidly diminishing cadaver.